Before we talk about survival, we need to talk about the room. One room. That is where this story lives. Not a house in the way you picture a house when someone says the word. One room, roughly 16 by 20 feet, built from timber cut on the same land it stood on. The logs fitted together and chinked with moss and clay, and whatever the builder had left over when the work was done. A fireplace at one end, stone and mortar, wide enough to burn logs 4 feet long. A door that swings inward, because a door that swings outward becomes useless when 3 feet of snow pile against it overnight. 2 windows, each about the size of a large book, covered not with glass, but with oiled paper or scraped animal hide, thin enough to let in the gray suggestion of daylight, thick enough to keep out the worst of the wind. This is New England in the early 1700s. This is the room where a family will spend the next 5 months. Stand in the doorway for a moment and look at it before anyone is inside. The floor is packed earth in the older cabins, wide pine planks in the newer ones. Cold in both cases, cold in a way that travels up through the soles of your feet and does not leave. The ceiling is low enough that a tall man ducks at the beams. The walls hold the smell of every fire ever burned in this room, every meal ever cooked, every wet coat ever hung to dry, every winter that came before this one. Near the fireplace, the main pot, iron, heavy, suspended from a crane arm that swings over the fire and back. This pot does more work than any other object in the cabin. It makes the morning porridge. It heats the water for washing. It holds the stew that simmers all afternoon. On a bad night, it holds snow that someone packed in from outside because the water bucket near the door froze solid before morning. The pot is black from years of use, and it has never been truly clean, and no one expects it to be. Against the far wall, a wooden bed frame with a rope lattice holding a mattress stuffed with corn husks or cattail fluff. Over the mattress, wool blankets, heavy and slightly rough. Over those, a coverlet pieced together from whatever cloth was available. Over that, on the coldest weeks, a deerskin or a bearskin if the family had one. The bed is not large. It will hold 2 adults and an infant. The older children will sleep on a pallet on the floor closer to the fire, which sounds like the worse arrangement and is actually the better one on the coldest nights, because heat from a colonial fireplace does not distribute evenly. It rises and it escapes. The floor holds what warmth it can. Beside the bed, a cradle, wooden, low to the ground, with a hood at one end to block the draft. This is where the infant will sleep when the mother can bear to put the baby down. Some nights she cannot. Look at the rest of it. A table, plank, and sawhorses, shoved against the wall when not in use to make room. 2 stools, a shelf holding a ceramic crock of salt, a smaller crock of lard, a wooden box with a lid for the things that need protecting, pegs on the wall near the door holding coats, a wool scarf, a hat with the brim gone soft from water. On the floor beneath the pegs, boots standing upright, still holding the shape of the feet that wore them. In the corner opposite the fireplace, the farthest point from any heat source in the room, a wooden trunk holding the things that do not need to stay warm. Extra cloth, a Bible, tools wrapped in oilcloth. Below the floor, reached by a wooden hatch near the back wall, the root cellar. This is the other room, the one that matters almost as much as the room above it. Down there in the cold and the dark barrels of salted pork, crocks of pickled vegetables, dried beans in cloth sacks, apples wrapped in straw, turnips and carrots packed in sand, a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth and wax. The root cellar is not a pantry. It is a calculation. Everything in it represents a decision made in September and October about how much the family would need to get from the first hard freeze to the first spring thaw. The cellar stays cold enough to preserve, but not so cold that things freeze and rot. The floor above holds just enough warmth from the fire. The family checks it often in the early weeks of winter, and less often as the season deepens. Not because they stop caring, but because they already know what is down there, and knowing does not change it. This is the cabin in late October of 1725, before the first real snow. It measures perhaps 320 square feet if you count every corner. It will house 5 people for 5 months. There is no second floor. There is no barn connected to the house. There is no kitchen separate from the sleeping area. No room where the children can be loud. No corner where 2 people can speak without being heard. Everything happens here. The cooking and the sleeping and the praying and the arguing and the sickness and the repair work and the long evenings when the dark comes at 4 in the afternoon and will not lift until 7 the next morning. A family that lives through a New England winter in a cabin like this one does not do it by accident. They do it because this room, as small and cold and smoky as it is, has been set up with the precision of something expected to keep people alive. Every object is where it is for a reason. Every decision about what to store and where to store it and how much to keep has been made before the cold arrives. Because once the cold arrives, the margin for error narrows to almost nothing. The question is not whether the room is comfortable. The question is whether everything in it will be enough. That question does not have an answer yet. It will not have one until April. The Wheelers did not leave behind a famous story. No monument carries their name. No chapter in a history book opens with their mourning. They were not governors or ministers or men who signed documents that mattered beyond their own county. They were a family living on a few acres of cleared land in Connecticut. And what we know about families like theirs comes not from what they wrote down, because most of them wrote very little, but from what they left behind: inventories of estates, church records, the dimensions of foundations that remain in the woods when everything above them has long since rotted away. The Wheelers are a composite family, built from the kinds of records ordinary New England families left behind: household inventories, settlement patterns, tools, architecture, and the daily practices that show up in diaries and account books of the period. A family like theirs could have lived on any one of 1,000 small farms scattered across New England in the 1720s. The conditions of their life were not unusual. The winter they were about to face was not unusual. That is exactly the point. Thomas Wheeler is 34 years old in the autumn of 1725. He came to this land as a young man, cleared it with his father, and when his father died, kept it. He knows every tree on the property, and which ones are worth felling, and which ones are better left standing. He knows where the soil goes wet in the spring, and where it drains fast enough to plant early. He knows how the wind comes down off the ridge to the north in January, and what it does to the east side of the cabin. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It lives in his body, the way all knowledge eventually does when you have lived in one place long enough and paid attention. Hannah Wheeler is 29. She has been in this cabin for 6 years, long enough that she stopped measuring her life against wherever she came from and started measuring it against itself. She notices things before they become problems, which, in a colonial farmhouse in the 1720s, is not a personality trait so much as a survival skill. She noticed, in September, that the south-facing wall had a new gap where 2 logs had shifted slightly apart. She packed it with moss and clay before Thomas saw it. She noticed in October that one of the wool blankets had a moth hole near the center, and she mended it before it spread. These are not dramatic actions. They are the actions of someone who understands that in a small system, small failures compound. Eli is 7. He is at the age where he is useful in a way he was not 2 years ago. Old enough to carry and fetch and hold and remember. He knows the names of every tool in the cabin and what each one is for. He can start a fire with a flint and steel if someone has already laid the tinder, which his father has been teaching him all summer, in the way fathers in this time and place teach things, by doing the task slightly more slowly than necessary, and letting the boy watch until the boy can do it himself. Mary is 4. She understands the cabin the way a 4-year-old understands a space, which is to say, completely and physically and without any of the context that would help explain why everything is the way it is. She knows the floor is cold in the morning. She knows the fire is not to be touched. She knows that when her mother picks up the iron pot by its handle using a folded cloth, she should stand back. These are things the cabin has taught her directly, without words. And then there is the infant. The baby was born 6 weeks before the first frost of 1725. A 6-week-old cannot protect its own warmth in any reliable way, which means that for the entirety of this winter, the infant's survival depends entirely on the warmth of the room and the warmth of the bodies around it. The baby has a name, but that name did not make it into any record we can confidently trace, because families like the Wheelers left behind very little that history could hold on to. What we can say is this: the infant existed. The infant was in that cabin. And every decision Thomas and Hannah made, from November through March, was made with the knowledge that one small body in that cradle by the fireplace had no margin at all. This is the family. 5 people. 1 room. 1 winter. They are not exceptional. They are not heroes in any way the word is usually meant. They are people who know how to do specific things in a specific place, and who have prepared as well as they know how to prepare, and who will now find out if that preparation was enough. Tens of thousands of people across New England lived in conditions not entirely unlike these. Farmers and their families on small, cleared plots. Husbands and wives and children, and sometimes an elderly parent, or a hired hand, or a neighbor's child taken in for the season. Mostly Protestant, mostly English descended by this point. living in communities their grandparents or great-grandparents had carved out of the forest a generation or two before. The frontier had moved west and north, but the life on these older farmsteads was still close to the edge in ways that people who live 2 or 3 generations later tend to forget. The edge was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was the gap in the wall you did not notice until February when the cold came through it. It was the cough that started as nothing and became something. It was the woodpile that looked like enough in October and looked different in January. It was the calculation in the root cellar that had seemed right when Hannah made it, and began to seem less certain as the weeks went on. Thomas sits on the stump outside the cabin door on an afternoon in late October, looking at the ridge to the north. The leaves are gone. The sky has the particular flat gray of a New England sky that is deciding whether to give you one more week or close down right now. He can smell snow in the air. The cold, mineral smell of it. The smell that every person who has lived through a New England winter knows before they can explain it. He goes inside. Hannah is at the fire. The baby is against her chest, wrapped in cloth, sleeping. Mary is on the floor, moving a wooden spool back and forth in some game that makes sense only to her. Eli is by the window, using the last of the afternoon light to look at something he found in the field. A stone or a piece of bone, holding it up the way children hold things they find, as if the light might explain it. Thomas stands at the door for a moment. Then he goes to the woodpile on the south side of the cabin and begins stacking what he has cut closer to the wall. Tighter. The way you stack when you are making room for more. He has been cutting since August. He will not stop until the ground freezes and makes it impossible. Outside, the sky makes its decision. The first flakes come down just before dark, light and uncertain, the kind that melt when they hit the ground. Not yet, but close. Thomas looks up at them. He goes back inside. It comes on a Tuesday, not with a storm, not with any drama that people who have never lived through a New England winter might expect. It comes the way most hard things come, quietly, while everyone is asleep, while the fire has burned down to coals and the room has given back most of the heat it borrowed from the afternoon. Thomas wakes before 3 in the morning, and he knows before he opens his eyes. The quality of the cold is different. Not the cold of a chilly October night that loosens by sunrise. This is the cold of something that has settled in and intends to stay, that has moved into the walls and the floor and the air above the bed, and is in no hurry to leave. He has felt this specific cold before. Every person who has spent more than one winter in New England knows the moment when the season stops negotiating. He gets up without waking Hannah. This requires a particular kind of movement, slow and deliberate, rolling to the edge of the rope lattice without letting it creak, getting his feet to the floor in one motion. He has done this hundreds of times. His body knows it. The floor takes his weight and gives him back cold through the soles of his feet. A cold several degrees sharper than anything he felt when he went to bed. He crosses to the fireplace. The coals are still there, orange and gray, in the dark, enough to work with. He lays 2 pieces of wood across them. Thin ones first, not the big logs, and kneels close and blows steadily until the thin pieces catch. Then a 3rd piece, slightly larger. Then he waits. A man who has built fires in a cold cabin for years learns to wait without rushing this part. Because rushing it collapses the structure and costs more time than the patience did. The fire, Bill. Thomas stays crouched in front of it for a few minutes after it no longer needs him. Not because he has to, but because the heat against his face is something he is not ready to move away from yet. The room begins to show itself in the firelight. The shapes of the children on the pallet near the hearth. The outline of Hannah in the bed. One arm curled around the infant without waking. The ceiling beams. The coats on the pegs near the door. He goes to the door and opens it just far enough to look out. The ground is white. Not deep. Not the white of a real snowfall. Just a skim of frost across every surface. The kind that turns the whole world pale and strained. The trees at the edge of the clearing stand in the dark, like things that have been there since before the cabin and will be there after it. The air coming through the gap has a clarity to it. Sharp and clean. The air of a temperature that has dropped past the point of ambiguity. He shuts the door. He stands for a moment in the middle of the room, looking at the fire, looking at the children, looking at the cradle where the infant sleeps. He does the thing that fathers in this situation do without deciding to do it. He listens. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3, until he can hear the rhythm he is looking for. The small, steady pull of the baby breathing. There it is. He goes back to bed. He will be up again in 2 hours to feed the fire, and 2 hours after that, and again before dawn. This is what the next 5 months look like at 3 in the morning, and 4, and 5. The fire is not something you light and walk away from. It is something you tend the way you tend anything that will cause a serious problem if you stop paying attention to it. In the New England colonies of the 1720s, fire was the most important thing a family owned. Not the land, not the tools, not the animals, the fire. Because the land and the tools and the animals all became problems without the fire. And the fire itself could become a problem of a different kind at any moment. Cabin fires were a known danger in colonial New England, and the families who lived in wood-framed, thatch-roofed, or wood-shingled structures understood this the way they understood all serious risks. Not as something abstract, but as something that had happened to people they knew or people their parents had known. So, colonial families in New England had a specific relationship with fire that is almost impossible to fully appreciate from the outside. They kept it alive continuously through the winter months, banking it at night to hold through until morning, feeding it at intervals measured not by clocks, but by sleep cycles and habit and the feel of the room when they woke. They built fireplaces wide and deep, wide enough to take logs 4 feet long and deep enough to hold a serious amount of fuel. They swept the hearth and maintained the chimney because a chimney clogged with creosote was a chimney fire waiting for the right moment. And they understood something about their fireplace that anyone who has stood in front of a colonial hearth quickly notices. It is not efficient. A fireplace of this design sends much of its heat up the chimney. The wall behind the fire gets hot. The air directly in front gets hot. The rest of the room receives warmth unevenly and in ways that follow no simple logic. The corner near the door stays cold. The ceiling, where heat rises and collects, is warm in a place where no one needs it to be warm. The floor, where children sleep, and where feet have to go first thing in the morning. gets only what drifts down from above. On the coldest nights of January, it is entirely possible to be sitting close enough to the fire to feel your face flush with heat while the back of your coat is cold to the touch. The fire heats the space in front of it. The cold owns everything else. This is why the arrangement of the room matters so much. The bed near the fireplace, not against the far wall. The children's pallet between the fire and the bed, not in a corner. The cradle on the side of the fire where the draft does not reach. Everything positioned to use what little heat the fire can spread, because the fire will spread it according to its own logic and not according to anyone's preference. And a family that fights that logic instead of working with it will be cold in ways that a family who works with it will not. Hannah knows this. She rearranged the room in November of their first winter here and has not moved anything significant since. Because what she ended up with after that first rearrangement was the configuration that worked. And you do not change something that works. Thomas gets up at 5 in the morning, feeds the fire again, and is standing at the window watching the sky go from black to dark blue-gray when Hannah wakes. She listens for the infant first, the same reflex Thomas had at 3 in the morning. The quick, unconscious count of breaths before anything else. Then she sits up. She looks at the frost on the inside corner of the window frame. A thin white feathering where the cold came through the oiled paper during the night. She looks at Thomas. He nods once. She gets up. The first frost has come and nothing dramatic has happened and nothing dramatic needs to happen. The season has changed and the family has changed with it. Shifted into a different register of daily life that will hold until March. There is no ceremony for this. There is breakfast to make, and a fire to keep, and children to get moving, and a day to get through. Hannah swings the pot arm over the fire. The day begins. That is the whole story of that night. The fire held. And because it held, nothing bad happened. And, in the winter of 1725, in a one-room cabin in Connecticut, nothing bad happening on a given night is not a small thing. It is the thing. There is a question that comes up when people first learn how colonial families managed their fires through a New England winter. The question is, what happened if it went out? Thomas Wheeler can answer this question without thinking about it. The way you answer questions whose answers live in your body rather than your mind. If the fire went out in the middle of January and the temperature outside had fallen far enough that the water near the far wall had a skin of ice on it by morning, the family had perhaps 2 or 3 hours before the room reached a temperature that was dangerous for the infant. The cast iron pot would be useless until the fire was rebuilt. The water bucket near the door would begin to ice over within the hour. And rebuilding a fire from nothing in a cold room with cold hands, using flint and steel and tinder that may have absorbed moisture from the air overnight, is not the quick and certain process that people raised around matches and lighters tend to imagine. This is why the fire could not die. Not as a rule anyone wrote down. As a physical fact of the situation, a fire going out was not an inconvenience. It was the beginning of a cascade of problems that compounded faster than they could be solved. And colonial families knew this the way they knew all the important things about their situation, from having seen it happen, or from having heard about it from someone who had. Thomas tends his fire the way a careful man tends any critical system. He knows his wood. And this matters more than almost anything else about fire management in a colonial cabin. Green wood, freshly cut, burns poorly, and produces a great deal of smoke and not nearly enough heat. Dry wood, seasoned for at least a year, burns clean and hot and holds coals well. This is why Thomas began cutting wood in August, not because he was anxious or overly cautious, but because the wood he cuts in August will be dry enough to burn well in January. And the wood he cuts in November will not. He knows which pieces to use when. In the morning, when he is rebuilding from banked coals, he uses the driest and thinnest pieces first, the ones that catch fast and make heat quickly. As the fire establishes itself, he moves to larger pieces. For the overnight bank, he uses the densest wood he has, the pieces that burn slowest and hold heat longest, laid at the back of the fireplace, in a way he learned from his father, and his father learned from wherever that knowledge came from before. Banking a fire for the night is a skill. You do not simply pile wood on and go to sleep. You arrange the coals, push them toward the back, lay the heaviest log across them in a position that will let it smolder without flaming up, and cover the whole arrangement with a thin layer of ash from the hearth floor. The ash acts as insulation, slowing the burn, holding the heat inside the massive coals so that 6 hours later there is still something to work with. A well-banked fire in a good fireplace can hold a viable coal bed through an 8-hour night. A poorly banked fire in a cold room can be dead by 2 in the morning. Thomas has woken to a dead fire twice in the years he has lived in this cabin. Both times were in his first winter here. He does not like to think about those mornings, the particular cold of a room where the fire has been out for hours, the way the room smells different when there is no smoke in it, the way the silence is different without the low sound of burning. He rebuilt both times, and the family was fine, and he did not let it happen again. What he changed was not the bedtime routine. What he changed was that he started waking once in the night to check. Just check. Not always to add wood, often just to look at the coals, to feel the heat from the fireplace against his hand held out at arm's length, to make a judgment about whether it will hold until morning. Half the time he goes back to bed without touching anything. The other half, he lays one piece of wood across the coals, a medium piece, nothing dramatic, and goes back to sleep. That one piece is usually enough. This habit costs him one interrupted night of sleep every night of winter for as long as he lives in this cabin. He has never once calculated what that costs him in total hours or in the slow accumulation of fatigue. It would not change anything if he did. Hannah manages the daytime fire. This is not a formal division of labor in any written sense. It is simply how the days have organized themselves over the years. Thomas is outside for most of the daylight hours, cutting or splitting or hauling or repairing or doing the dozen other things a colonial farm in winter requires. Hannah is inside. The fire is inside. The management of it falls to her, the way the management of most things inside the cabin falls to her. She feeds it at intervals she has learned to read from the look of the flames rather than from any clock. When the flames are bright and the wood is actively burning, she leaves it alone. When the flames begin to die back and the color shifts from orange toward the deeper red of coals, she adds wood, 2 pieces, sometimes 3, laid across the existing coals at an angle that lets the air move through. She does this while stirring the pot, while nursing the infant, while keeping an eye on Mary. While working at the table, on whatever sewing or mending or preparation the season requires, the fire management is not a separate task she stops to perform. It is woven into everything else she does in this room. A continuous background awareness, the way breathing is a continuous background process. Something that is always happening, even when her attention is fully somewhere else. The children learn it from watching. Eli already knows not to let the fire get below a certain point, the point where only coals remain and no active flame. He knows to tell his mother when it reaches that point if she has not noticed. He does not yet add wood himself, not without being told, because the risk of a 7-year-old misjudging the situation is not a risk worth the saved effort. But he knows how to read the fire, which is the first thing. You have to be able to read it before you can manage it. There is one more thing about fire in a colonial cabin that does not come up often: the smell. A cabin heated entirely by open fire smells of smoke in every fiber of everything inside it. The blankets smell of smoke. The coats on the pegs smell of smoke. The food, if it is not stored in the sealed cellar below, absorbs smoke over the course of a winter. The hair of every person in the cabin smells of smoke. The wood of the walls and the furniture has absorbed so many winters of fire that it would smell of burning even if you moved it outdoors. This is not a complaint that colonial families made, at least not in any record that survives. It was simply the smell of winter, of shelter, of the thing that kept them alive. It meant the fire was burning, and the fire burning meant the night was manageable, and the morning would come and the family would be there to see it. On the 42nd night of winter, Thomas gets up at 2:45 in the morning, crosses to the fireplace, and holds his hand out toward the coals. The heat pushes back against his palm. He looks at the arrangement of wood, at the way the coals are distributed, at the particular orange of them in the dark room. He listens to the infant breathing. He listens to the wind outside, which is moving from the northwest tonight and will push cold against the north-facing wall until dawn. He lays one piece of wood across the back of the fire. He goes back to bed. The fire holds. That is the whole story of that night. There is no other story. The fire held, and because it held, nothing bad happened. And in the winter of 1725, in a one-room cabin in Connecticut, nothing bad happening is the thing you are working toward every single night, from November until the ground thaws. Some nights, it is the only thing. Thomas Wheeler picks up his axe on a morning in mid-August and walks into the woods. This is not an unusual thing for a man in his situation to do in August. Every farmer, on every small clearing in New England, is doing the same thing, or has already been doing it for weeks, or is about to start and knows he is running behind. The cutting of wood for winter is not a task that waits for a convenient moment. It has a deadline. And the deadline is not the first frost or the first snowfall. The deadline is approximately 1 year before you need the wood. Because wood that is cut and split and stacked needs time to dry. And wood that has not dried burns poorly. And wood that burns poorly costs you more than wood that burns well in every way you can measure. Thomas understood this, the way he understands most things about this land. Not from reading about it, from having gotten it wrong once, early on, and from having spent a February burning green wood that hissed and smoked and gave back a fraction of the heat it should have while the room stayed colder than it needed to be. He did not get it wrong twice. The wood he is cutting this August will not be the wood he burns this coming winter. The wood he burns this coming winter is the wood he cut and split and stacked in the summer and fall of 1724. Now dry and ready, after more than a year of sitting in the stack on the south side of the cabin, the wood he is cutting now is for the winter after this one. A man who thinks only one season ahead in a colonial New England farmhouse is a man who is always slightly behind. The woodpile on the south side of the cabin is one of the most important structures on the Wheeler property. It is not a casual accumulation. The logs are split and arranged so that air can move through the pile and continue the drying process. Covered at the top with a layer of bark or rough boards to shed rain and snow without sealing the sides, which would trap moisture instead of releasing it. The stack runs perhaps 12 feet along the cabin wall and stands about 5 feet high. To someone who does not know what they are looking at, it is simply a pile of firewood. To Thomas, it is a calculation made physical. A season measured in split logs. How much wood does a family need for a New England winter? The answer depends on the cabin, the fireplace, the severity of the season, the quality of the wood, and how cold the family is willing to be. But the truth that every colonial farmer knew was this: more than you think, and probably more than you have. The fireplace in a cabin like the Wheelers is hungry in a way that is easy to underestimate from the outside. It burns continuously from November through March, roughly 150 days. It burns through the night at a slower rate and through the day at a faster one. On a mild day in late autumn, the fire needs feeding every few hours. On a hard January night, when the temperature has fallen far enough that the water near the far wall has a skin of ice on it by morning, the fire needs feeding constantly, and the wood it consumes on a night like that would have lasted 2 days in October. The truth is simple. A winter woodpile is not a pile. It is a season measured in logs. Thomas looks at his woodpile in late October and does what he does every year. He counts, not the individual logs, but the sections of the stack, each one representing a volume he knows from experience. He walks the length of the pile. He checks the interior by pulling a log from the middle and feeling the weight of it, the dryness of it, the way it has lost the heaviness of green wood and become something lighter and more willing. He puts it back. Then he stands there doing arithmetic that has no paper and no pencil. There is a version of this calculation that comes out fine. There is a version that does not. Thomas has lived through enough winters to know that the version that comes out fine in October and the version that actually plays out from November through March are not always the same version, and that the gap between them is filled by things he cannot predict in October. A colder than usual January, a sickness that requires the cabin to be kept warmer than normal for 2 weeks, a stretch of weather so severe that he cannot get to the remaining stack and has to burn from the reserve he keeps just inside the door. He has prepared for these possibilities. He has tried to cut more than enough. Whether he has succeeded, he will not know until March. He goes inside. The wood that comes into the cabin each day goes through a short journey before it reaches the fire. Thomas or Eli carries it from the main stack to a smaller pile just inside the door. Enough for a day or two. sheltered from snow and accessible without going outside in the dark at 2 in the morning. From there, Hannah takes what she needs for the fire, piece by piece, as the day requires. The wood near the door has usually been inside long enough to have lost any surface moisture from the stack, which makes it easier to catch. Wood carried in directly from a snow-covered pile can be slow to light, and slow to light costs time and patience that neither Thomas nor Hannah has in surplus. The axe that Thomas uses for splitting is kept inside the cabin in winter. This is not carelessness about leaving tools out. Metal left in freezing temperatures becomes brittle, and a wooden handle can contract enough that the head loosens. A tool that fails at the moment you need it most is worse than not having it. And a broken axe handle in January in Connecticut, 20 miles from the nearest ironmonger, is a problem with no quick solution. Eli knows where the axe is kept. He knows not to touch it without his father. He also knows, with the particular clarity that 7-year-olds have about the things that matter, that the woodpile is not something you play near, and not something you take from carelessly, and not something you let get low without telling someone. He has been watching his father look at that woodpile his whole life. He does not have the words for what his father does when he stands there at the end of October looking at the stack, but he understands what the looking means. It means the winter is real now. It means everything that comes next depends on whether the counting comes out right. On a morning in late January that Thomas cannot see from where he stands right now, he will walk to the south side of the cabin and look at what is left of the stack. And the arithmetic he does in his head will come out different than he wants it to. That morning is not here yet. The pile is full. The wood is dry. The winter has just begun. Thomas looks at the stack one more time before he goes inside. He does not say anything. He goes in and shuts the door. On a morning in late November, Hannah Wheeler goes down through the cellar hatch before breakfast. She does not take the candle. She does not need it. She knows this cellar the way Thomas knows the woodpile, by feel and by the weight of things and by the slow accumulating evidence of weeks of small withdrawal. She goes down the 4 wooden steps into the cold, dark, and stands for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. And then she does what she does every few days in the early weeks of winter. She counts 2 barrels of salted pork, each holding enough meat for roughly 1 serving per person per day for 60 days, if she is careful about the portions. 3 crocks of pickled cabbage and turnip, dense and sour and preserved in brine, made from salt she bought at considerable expense from the general store the previous spring. A bushel of dried beans in cloth sacks, which will need long soaking and long cooking but will stretch a meal in ways that meat alone cannot. 2 bushels of cornmeal, kept dry and cold, protected as best she can from the mice. Apples wrapped individually in straw, perhaps 4 dozen of them, the keeping varieties that resist rot through a New England winter, which she checks every week, and removes the ones starting to turn before they can damage the ones beside them. Root vegetables packed in sand, turnips, parsnips, carrots. Not enough of any of them, but some of each. 1 wheel of hard cheese sealed in wax and cloth. A small crock of lard. A larger crock of rendered fat from the hog they slaughtered in October. She stands in the cellar and looks at all of it, and runs the number in her head the same way Thomas runs the woodpile number. except that Hannah has been running this particular number since September, and she knows exactly what it looks like from every angle. 5 people. 150 days. The infant does not eat solid food, and will not for months, which reduces the solid food requirement slightly, but increases Hannah's own requirement. Because nursing a baby through a winter while doing the physical labor of running a colonial household burns more fuel than the body can afford to be careless about. Thomas does the hardest outdoor labor and needs the most. Eli and Mary eat less than adults, but more than their size would suggest. Because children in a cold environment burn energy staying warm in a way that children in a heated house in a later century simply do not. 150 days. 5 people. The food in the cellar below. Hannah has done this calculation before. She knows what the margin looks like in November, and she knows what it looks like in February, and she knows they are not the same number. What makes the difference between them is how carefully she manages the distance between now and then. She goes back up. She does not ration in November. Rationing in November would be unnecessarily severe and would also be bad strategy. Because bodies doing hard physical work in cold weather need to eat enough to function. A household that begins the winter already running at a deficit will reach March in worse condition than one that ate well through December and tightened in February when February required it. What she does instead is cook in a way that gets the most out of every ingredient. The pork goes into the pot with dried beans and water and a piece of salt and becomes a stew that feeds the family for 2 meals instead of 1. The cornmeal becomes porridge in the morning, thick and hot, the kind that sits in the stomach through a cold morning of outdoor work. She adds a small amount of the rendered fat when she has it to spare, because fat in winter is not excess. It is insulation. The pickled vegetables come out of the crock in small amounts, alongside the main dish, sharp and sour, in a way that cuts through the monotony of the salt pork and beans that will otherwise be the dominant flavor of the next 4 months. What people who have never eaten a colonial winter diet tend to miss is that the food is not the punishment it sounds like. When you list the ingredients, the salt pork, properly soaked to draw out some of the salt before cooking, is savory and substantial. The beans absorb the flavor of the pork in the fat and become something better than their plain form. The porridge, with a small addition of maple syrup, on the mornings when there is maple syrup, is warm and filling in a way designed for a body about to go out and do hard physical work in bitter cold. But it is monotonous. By December, the family is eating a version of the same 3 or 4 things they will eat through March. The variety comes from small shifts, a different ratio of ingredients, the occasional addition of something fresh when fresh is available. A rabbit Thomas snares on a good day. A fish pulled through the ice when the pond is frozen solid enough to stand on and the fishing is worth the cold. These are not regular supplements. They are occasional gifts from the land that the family accepts without counting on them. Hannah counts on nothing she does not have in the cellar below. Everything else is extra. The infant changes the food situation in one specific way. Hannah is nursing, which means that every morning when she wakes and every evening when she sits by the fire before sleep, the question of whether she has eaten enough that day is not just a question about her own comfort. A nursing mother who is seriously underfed may struggle to maintain her own strength. And in the worst conditions, her milk supply can suffer. Hannah knows this in the way women in her position know things that are never written down anywhere, passed from mother to daughter and neighbor to neighbor through the practical knowledge of keeping a child alive. She eats, not more than the situation allows, but enough. She is careful about this in a way she is not always careful about other things for herself. The fire can wait a moment. The mending can wait. The food cannot. There is an evening in late November when Hannah is sitting by the fire after supper, the infant asleep in her arms, the older children on their pallet, Thomas across the table with his eyes half closed from a day of work. The pot has been scraped. The bowls are stacked. The cellar hatch is closed and latched. Hannah looks at the hatch. She is not worried. November is too early to worry. But she is aware, in the part of her mind that runs the calculation constantly without being asked, of how far down the barrels of salt pork are tonight compared to where they were 2 weeks ago. She is aware of how many apples she has already had to pull for turning. She is aware that the beans are going faster than she planned, because Thomas is hungrier than she planned, because the work of this particular autumn has been harder than last year's. She adjusts the number in her head. She does not say anything to Thomas. He has his own numbers to run. They both know that February is when the real accounting happens, and February is still 3 months away. And between now and then, there is work to be done, and children to feed, and a fire to keep, and a winter to get through one day at a time. She shifts the infant to her other arm. The fire settles. The cabin holds the smell of the evening meal, and the smoke, and the particular human warmth of 5 people in a small room at the end of a day. And outside the wind is moving through the tops of the trees at the edge of the clearing, and the cold is doing what the cold does in November in Connecticut, which is remind you in very specific physical terms that the only thing standing between your family and it is the room you are sitting in and the preparation you did before it arrived. The preparation was good, for no, it is enough. Hannah Wheeler puts the infant down at 8:30 on a December night and stands beside the cradle for a moment longer than she needs to. Not from worry, from the particular habit of a woman who has learned that the transition from held to cradle is the moment most likely to undo itself. That the baby who seemed fully asleep in her arms can become a baby who is not fully asleep. The instant it leaves the warmth of her body, she stands. She waits. The infant's breathing stays slow and even. She steps back. She looks at the cradle's position the way she looks at it every night. Not consciously checking, but aware in the background, the way she is always aware of the things that matter most in this room. Close enough to the fireplace to benefit from the heat that radiates off the stone chimney mast through the night. Far enough that no spark or shifting log presents any risk. On the side of the bed away from the door. Away from the draft that moves across the floor when the temperature outside drops far enough to find its way under the gap at the bottom. The position of that cradle was not decided in an afternoon. It was worked out over the first weeks of the infant's life, through the small adjustments that come from watching and noticing and moving the thing 6 inches and watching again. Where it sits now is where it will sit every night of this winter. Thomas is banking the fire. This is the most important fire building of the day, the one that determines whether there are viable coals at 3 in the morning, or whether he wakes to a room that has given back everything it earned through the evening. He uses the large, dense pieces he set aside specifically for this, arranges them with the attention of someone who knows that small differences in placement produce large differences in outcome, covers the arrangement with a thin, even layer of ash from the hearth floor. He stands back and looks at it. Then he gets into bed. Now the room does what the room does every night, from November through March, and it is worth understanding how. Because sleep in a one-room colonial cabin is not a retreat to comfort. It is the most efficient system the family has for surviving the hours when the fire is at its lowest and the cold is at its work. 5 people in a small space generate heat. This is not a sentimental observation. It is physics. The body of an adult at rest produces roughly the same amount of heat as a candle. And while that sounds like very little, in a room that is already partially warmed by a banked fire and enclosed on all sides by insulating wood and clay, the combined output of 5 breathing bodies makes a measurable difference. Colonial families slept together not only from necessity, but because together they were warmer than apart, and warmer meant better odds of reaching morning in good condition. Thomas and Hannah sleep in the bed. Hannah sleeps on the inside, closer to the wall, which is the colder side, but which puts her between the wall and the cradle. On the coldest nights, when the temperature outside falls far enough that the draft from the north wall becomes something you can feel from the middle of the room, the infant does not sleep in the cradle at all. On those nights, the infant sleeps against Hannah, inside the blankets, with her body as the primary heat source. Hannah wakes during these nights the way mothers wake. Not fully, but enough. Enough to know where the baby is. Enough to adjust without crushing. Enough to be aware through the dark of the small breathing beside her. She does not sleep deeply on these nights. She has accepted this the way she has accepted most of the conditions of this winter, as a fact of the situation, rather than a problem requiring a solution. Eli and Mary sleep on the pallet near the hearth. The pallet is close to the fire, which people who think of fire as something dangerous to sleep near might find alarming. But the geometry of a colonial fireplace makes the actual danger zone a specific area directly in front of the opening, not the wider arc at a distance and to the sides. The pallet is to the side, at a distance, close enough to catch the warmth that radiates from the firebox and from the stone mass of the hearth, far enough that a shifting log in the night is not a catastrophe. Mary goes to sleep almost immediately, with the completeness of a 4-year-old who has spent the full supply of energy available to a 4-year-old and has nothing left. Eli takes longer. He lies on his back and looks at the ceiling and thinks about whatever 7-year-olds think about in the dark. And eventually his breathing slows and he is gone. The bed itself is a system. First, the mattress, cornhusk filled, which rustles when either of them moves, but which has been compressed over years into something that holds its shape. Over the mattress, a linen sheet. Then the first wool blanket, heavy and rough. Real wool from sheep that colonial families either kept themselves or obtained from neighbors. Then the second wool blanket. Then whist coverlet Hannah made in their second winter here. Heavier than it looks because of the density of the layers she used. On the coldest nights, a deerskin goes over all of it, the hair side down, creating a top layer that stops the air moving through from the walls. Two people, under all of this, generate a body heat environment that is genuinely warm within an hour of lying down. The system works not by adding heat from outside, but by trapping the heat the bodies produce and preventing it from escaping into the cold air above. The air between the layers warms and stays warm as long as the layers above it are intact. This is the same principle birds use when they puff their feathers. The same principle a good wool coat uses. The same principle the root cellar uses to keep the food from freezing, trapping the earth's own warmth beneath the ground. Colonial families did not have words for the thermodynamics of any of this. They had something better. They had the knowledge of what worked, refined through winters of experience and passed between neighbors and across generations. As practical and precise as any engineering. Outside, the wind is moving from the northwest, the direction that brings the coldest air down from the interior of the continent, air that has been traveling for days over frozen ground and that arrives at the north wall of the Wheeler cabin carrying all of that cold inside it. The north wall holds, not perfectly. No wall built from logs and clay holds perfectly against a hard winter wind. There are places where the cold comes through. Places Hannah has packed and repacked and will pack again in the morning when the light is good enough to see where the new gaps have opened. But the wall holds well enough, which is all any wall in this place and time can do. Inside, the fire gives back what it can. 5 bodies do the rest. By 10 o'clock, the room has found the temperature it will hold, until Thomas wakes at 3. It is not warm in the way a heated house in a later century is warm. It is warm enough. And in the 1720s, in a one-room cabin in Connecticut, warm enough is the only standard that anyone is measuring against. Hannah lies in the dark and listens to the breathing in the room. Thomas, already slowing towards sleep. The children on the pallet, their breath, the faster, lighter breath of children who go under quickly and deeply. The infant in the cradle, the smallest sound of all, the one she would hear through anything. She counts them without meaning to. All here, all breathing. The fire low but holding. She closes her eyes. On the morning of December 21st, in 1725, the sun rises over the Connecticut hills at approximately 7 o'clock. It sets at approximately 4 in the afternoon. 9 hours of daylight. 16 hours of dark. Sit with that number for a moment. 16 hours of darkness in a one-room cabin lit by open fire and tallow candles, with no electric light to push it back, no screen to look at, no lamp that can be switched on with a thought. For 5 people in one room, from November through February. Darkness is not an absence of light. It is the dominant condition of every day. Thomas feels it on the walk back from the woodlot on a December afternoon. He leaves the trees at the edge of the clearing, and the light is already failing. The sky gone from pale blue to the dull pewter of late afternoon. And he has perhaps 20 minutes before it will be dark enough that he cannot safely work outside. He picks up his pace. The cold is sharper when the light goes. He has always noticed this. The way the temperature seems to drop with the sun, even on days when the clouds make the change in light gradual. He does not know why this happens. He knows that it does. He gets back to the cabin before dark. He always gets back before dark. The candles in the Wheeler cabin are tallow, made from the rendered fat of animals, poured into molds in the autumn when there is time for it. Tallow candles burn and give light. They also smoke. They smell of the fat they are made from, and they are not dramatically bright. A single tallow candle in a colonial cabin does not illuminate a room. It illuminates a circle of perhaps 3 or 4 feet in which a person can do close work. And beyond that circle, the room falls away into a dimness that the fire helps with but does not resolve. Hannah's eyes have adjusted to this over years. She can do close work by the light of one candle in a way she could not when she was younger and less practiced. She knows to position herself so the candlelight falls directly onto the work rather than her face. She knows which tasks need the candle and which can be done by firelight alone. And she uses the candle only for what requires it. Because tallow is not free, and candles are not infinite, and February is a long way from December. What 16 hours of darkness does to the mind is something colonial families understood in practice without having the language to describe precisely. The mind needs light for more than work. It needs light for the sense of time passing, for the feeling that the day has a shape with a beginning and a middle and an end that makes sense. When darkness comes at 4 in the afternoon, the day loses its architecture. The hours between 4 and bedtime feel like a different kind of time than the hours before 4. A suspension rather than a continuation. A waiting period the body moves through without quite inhabiting. Some historians who study pre-industrial communities have observed that before artificial light, people often slept in 2 phases. A first sleep and a second sleep with a period of wakefulness between them, and that this middle of the night waking was understood as normal rather than as a problem to be solved. Whether every colonial family experienced sleep exactly this way varied by household and circumstance, but the pattern fits what the darkness required. Sleep when the dark comes. Wake in the night. Tend the fire. Lie quietly until the second sleep comes, and rise when the light returns. Thomas wakes in the night and checks the fire, not only because the fire needs checking, but because waking in the night is what darkness-governed sleep looks like. He does not lie awake worrying about this. It is simply what the night is. The daylight hours are used with a concentration that people in later centuries rarely bring to their days. Because the daylight hours are genuinely limited, and everyone in the cabin knows it. Thomas goes outside at first light, because the outdoor work can only be done in the light. Hannah positions herself near the window for the fine work, the sewing and mending that requires her best vision. In the hours between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, when the winter sun is at its highest, and the light through the oiled paper window is at its best. When the light fails at 4, the work shifts. The coarser tasks continue by firelight. The conversation happens in the evenings. The children's games happen in the dim orange of the fire. Hannah tells Mary a story sometimes. Not a long one, just something short and specific. Something about the woods, or the way the seasons work. And Mary listens with the complete attention of a 4-year-old for whom a story in the firelight is the best thing available in this room at this hour. Eli asks questions in the evenings. Not always. He is not a child who fills silence for the sake of filling it. But there are evenings when something he has seen or heard during the day works its way out after supper. He asks his father about the trees. Which ones burn best and why? He asks his mother about the things in the cellar. Why some foods last and others do not. Why the apples get wrapped in straw. He asks about the frost on the inside of the window. How it forms. Why it makes that particular feathery pattern and not some other. Thomas answers what he can. Hannah answers what she can. The things neither of them can answer, they say they do not know, which is the honest answer, and also a useful one. A child who learns early that adults will tell him the truth about the limits of their knowledge grows up with a more accurate map of the world than one who does not. The darkness has one gift that is easy to overlook. It is genuine darkness. On the clear nights, when Thomas steps outside before bed to check the weather and look at the sky before the temperature drives him back in, the stars are the stars as they actually are, not filtered through a glow of distant light sources, not diminished by anything. The winter sky over a Connecticut clearing in December of 1725 is the whole sky, every star in its place. The arm of the galaxy visible overhead like a brushstroke across the dark. He does not stand there long. The cold does not allow for long, but he looks up at it, and it is very large. And the cabin behind him is the warmest thing within a long walk in any direction. And after a few minutes, he goes back inside. He adds one piece of wood to the fire. He goes to bed. The darkness holds the clearing and the trees and the sleeping family until the light comes back at 7 the next morning. 9 hours of it. No more. The ration that December allows. It is what there is. And they work with what there is. And this is how the dark weeks pass. One candle at a time. One evening at a time. One slow brightening of the eastern sky at a time. Until the days begin, almost imperceptibly, to stretch again. Thomas Wheeler is at the well before 6 in the morning. He does not go there because he planned to start his day at the well. He goes there because the water bucket near the cabin door has a skin of ice across the top, which means the water inside is too cold to be useful for cooking and too cold for the infant's morning wash. And getting water that is actually water rather than near ice is the first problem the day has put in front of him. So he deals with it first. The well is 20 feet from the cabin door. In October, 20 feet is nothing. A quick walk, a crank of the handle, a full bucket carried back in one hand. On this January morning, the path between the door and the well has been packed to ice by weeks of foot traffic, and the temperature is far enough below freezing that the air against his face feels like pressure rather than just cold. And the well itself has a rime of ice around the lip that he chips away with the long-handled tool he keeps just inside the door, specifically for this purpose. He lowers the bucket. He brings it up full. He carries it back along the icy path with the particular careful gait of a man who has learned through painful experience that a fall on frozen ground while carrying a full bucket of water costs him the water. The time it took to get the water. The additional time to get up and assess the damage. And potentially a great deal more than that. If the fall is bad enough, he gets back to the cabin without falling. He does this twice a day, sometimes 3 times. This is the water problem. and it is one of the most constant and least discussed difficulties of colonial winter life. Water, in the modern world, arrives at a faucet at whatever temperature is needed, and in whatever quantity is needed, and at no physical cost to the person who needs it. In the winter of 1725, water is a thing that freezes, that has to be fetched, that has to be carried, that has to be heated before it is useful for most purposes, that has to be managed as carefully as food and wood, because without it, nothing in the cabin functions. The bucket near the door holds what it holds. The pot on the fire holds what it holds. There is no capacity to store large quantities of water inside the cabin where it will stay unfrozen. Not without giving up space. The family does not have, so the water is outside, locked in the well and in the ground and in the packed snow, waiting to be brought in and thawed into usefulness, one trip at a time. On the days when the weather makes going to the well genuinely dangerous, Thomas packs snow into the pot from just outside the door and melts it over the fire. This works. It works slowly, because snow is mostly air, and a full pot of snow produces a surprisingly small amount of water. And it works at the cost of fuel the fire would otherwise be using to heat the room, but in a storm that keeps everyone inside for 2 or 3 days. This is how the family gets water. Hannah manages the pot during these stretches, keeping snow going in and warm water coming out, never letting the fire drop low enough to slow the process. The children drink less water in cold weather than they do in the heat of summer, and Hannah watches this more carefully than she lets on. The cold suppresses the body's signal for thirst. A child who is not drinking enough water does not always feel thirsty. She saw this with Eli when he was 3. The way he went 2 days with very little water until his eyes had a particular dullness that told her what the problem was before he could say it. She made him drink a full cup before anything else that morning, and she has paid attention to this every winter since. The water is only one piece of the daily labor that the season imposes. There is also the ash. Thomas sweeps the fireplace every morning, not because cleanliness requires it, but because fire management does. A fireplace choked with ash does not draw properly. A fireplace that does not draw properly fills the room with smoke and burns wood inefficiently, both of which are problems that cost more to deal with than the 5 minutes of sweeping. The ash goes into a barrel outside the cabin door where it accumulates through the winter. In the spring, it will become lye. The lye will become soap. In a colonial household, nothing that has a use gets discarded. There is the chinking. This is a task that Thomas does on a slow circuit of the cabin exterior every few days through the winter months, looking for new gaps where the mixture of moss and clay between the logs has cracked or shifted or been worked loose by the freeze and thaw cycle that attacks the material constantly. New England winters do not hold a steady temperature. They drop and rise and drop again. And every time the temperature crosses the freezing point in either direction, the moisture in the chinking expands or contracts and opens gaps that were not there the week before. He carries a small bag of the patching mixture, clay and dried moss worked together, and presses it into the gaps when he finds them. His hands are bare for this work because mittens make the fine pressing impossible. He puts them back on when he is done. The skin across the back of his hands is dry enough to crack at the knuckles from the constant exposure to cold and moisture and rough work. And there is a specific crack along the side of his right thumb that has been there since December, and that opens a little wider every few days and closes a little as the week goes on and never fully heals and never gets bad enough to stop the work. Hannah's daily labor inside the cabin runs its own list. The fire? Always the fire. The continuous background management that she weaves into everything else she does. The pot, the porridge, the stew, the timing of the food in a cabin where the only heat source for cooking is the same heat source keeping 5 people alive. The infant, who needs nursing and changing and holding and settling in a rotation that does not pause for anything else. The older children, who need feeding and redirecting and kept from the things in a one-room cabin that are dangerous. And in a one-room cabin with an open fire and iron tools and sharp knives, that is not a small category. The floor she sweeps every day. Not for appearance, but because a swept floor is a floor she can see clearly. And a floor she can see clearly is a floor where she can find what has fallen or been left where it will cause a problem. The washing happens once a week on a good week. Less on a hard one. Not the full washing of warm months, which requires quantities of hot water and outdoor drying space that winter does not allow. The winter washing is a managed version of the task, done at the fireside with the smallest amount of hot water that will accomplish the purpose. Wet cloth in a cold cabin takes hours to dry, and until it dries, it makes the room feel damper and colder than it already is. So Hannah washes in the morning and hangs things as close to the fire as is safe, and by evening, most of it is dry enough. The smell of damp wool drying is one of the constant smells of the cabin in the deep winter months. Mixing with the smoke and the salt pork and the tallow candle, and the particular warm animal smell of 5 people in a small room. This is the smell of the cabin in January. Every member of the family stopped noticing it weeks ago. The way you stop noticing the smells of a place that has become entirely familiar. It is simply the air. It is simply home. Eli moves through his piece of the daily labor with the steadiness of a child who has had enough time with a task that it has stopped feeling like a task. He brings wood from the pile by the door to the space beside the fireplace every morning. 4 or 5 pieces. Enough to carry the fire through the first part of the day without his father having to stop what he is doing outside. He fills the smaller water vessel from the bucket when his mother asks. He sweeps the hearth on the mornings Thomas tells him to. The quick maintenance sweep that keeps the ash from building up between the full clearings. He does these things now without being reminded. Neither Thomas nor Hannah can identify the day this changed. The day the reminding became unnecessary. It happened the way most things in this household happen, through repetition, until the repetition became reflex, until the reflex became simply the shape of the morning. At the end of a day in late January, Thomas comes in from outside and sits on his stool near the fire with his hands in his lap. He does not reach for the water cup. He does not take off his coat immediately. He sits with the particular stillness of a body that has been working in cold for 8 hours and has arrived at a warm place and needs a moment before it can do anything else. Hannah sees this. She gets the small crock of lard from the shelf and sets it on the table beside him without a word. He opens it and works a small amount into the crack along his thumb. into the knuckles, into the dry skin across the backs of both hands. It is not a remedy in any medical sense. It is a small mercy in a season that does not offer many of those, the momentary relief of something soft against something that has been hard and rough and cold for months. He puts the lid back on the crock. He sets it back on the shelf himself. The fire settles. Tomorrow the water will need fetching, and the ash will need sweeping, and the walls will need checking, and the wood will need carrying, and all of it will need doing again. The same tasks, in the same order, for the same reasons. Because the winter does not offer a day off from being winter. Thomas knows this. He pulls off his coat. He sits back down. The fire is burning well. The children are fed. The water bucket near the door is full and not yet frozen. For tonight, that is everything. On the morning, Thomas Wheeler goes out to cut additional wood in the storm. The morning that arrives in late January, and that will have its full account in a later chapter. He does not simply put on his coat and walk outside. He dresses the way a man dresses when he knows that what he is putting on his body is the only thing standing between himself and conditions that will begin to damage him within minutes of exposure. He has known men who did not take this seriously. He does not need to think about what happened to them to remember why it matters. He starts with the layer closest to his skin, a linen shirt, already worn, already at body temperature from the night. This matters because cold cloth against warm skin pulls heat from the body before the cloth has time to warm up. And in the time it takes cold cloth to reach body temperature on a January morning in Connecticut, the body has already begun a process of heat loss that requires energy to reverse. The linen is not warm in itself. It is a base layer, a surface against which the next layer can trap air. Over the linen, a wool shirt. Wool is the material of survival in a colonial New England winter in a way that no other readily available fabric can match. It is not soft. It is not comfortable against bare skin, which is why the linen goes on first. But wool does something that linen and most plant-based fabrics cannot do, which is that it continues to insulate even when it is damp. A man caught in cold, wet snow wearing a wool coat is in a difficult situation. The same man wearing a coat made of linen or other plant fibers is in a far more dangerous one. The fiber structure of wool traps air even when the surface is wet. Holding enough warmth to matter when mattering is the difference between getting home and not getting home. Over the wool shirt, a heavier wool coat, long enough to cover the hips. The length matters in a way that has nothing to do with fashion. The hips and lower back are places where the body loses heat readily, where major blood vessels run close to the surface on their way to and from the legs, where cold that gets in through an inadequately covered gap travels efficiently toward the core. A coat that covers the hips is a thermal decision. Wool stockings pulled up over the knees. Leather breeches over those. Leather is not warm in itself, but it is windproof. And in a January storm, with wind coming off the ridge to the north, a property that stops the wind is worth more than extra wool that lets the wind move freely through it. The leather stops the wind. The wool underneath holds the heat. Boots, thaw, leather, with a thick sole. Frozen earth pulls heat up through the feet with a persistence that is worth understanding. Thomas knows this not as a scientific principle, but as a physical fact of his own body. The way his feet go cold first. The way cold feet affect the whole body's sense of warmth. The way a man who has lost feeling in his toes is a man whose judgment about how long he can safely stay outside has already been compromised. His boots come to mid-calf. On very cold days he wears an extra wool stocking that makes the fit tight, which is not comfortable, but creates a trapped layer of air inside the boot that the looser fit does not. A wool hat pulled down to cover the ears. Wool mittens, not gloves. Mittens keep the fingers warmer than gloves because the fingers share their warmth with each other inside the mitten rather than each being isolated in its own tube of fabric. Thomas knows this from winters of comparison. From the particular experience of coming inside after a long morning and finding that hands in mittens recovered faster and hurt less than hands in gloves, he wore one winter when that was what he had. He takes the mittens off when he needs to do close work. He puts them back on as soon as the close work is done. The system is not complicated. It is layered cloth, each layer doing a specific job, the whole assembly working together to create an envelope of warm air around the body that the body's own heat maintains. The same principle as the blanket system on the bed. The same principle as the banked fire. Trap what you have. Slow the loss. Let the system work. What destroys the system is moisture. This is the thing that matters most, and the thing that is easiest to underestimate from the outside. Moisture from outside, from snow and sleet, working its way through the outer layers toward the wool. Moisture from inside, from the sweat of a man doing hard physical work in a well-insulated set of clothes. Both kinds of moisture are problem. The external moisture the outer leather resists, though not indefinitely. The internal moisture is more insidious. A man splitting and hauling wood in January will sweat. He is working hard, and he is dressed for standing in the cold, not for the heat of sustained labor. And the sweat that results has nowhere to go. It wicks into the linen and into the wool and stays there. And if he stops working suddenly and stands still in the cold air, the moisture in his clothing begins pulling heat from his body faster than dry clothing would, faster than the cold air alone could. Thomas knows the feeling of this. He learned it once, years ago, before he fully understood what was happening. Standing still after a long morning of work and feeling the cold arrive from inside his coat rather than outside it. He knows now to open his coat when the work is generating too much heat inside it. He knows to stop before the sweating becomes the problem. He knows when his body is approaching the temperature where wet clothing becomes the greater risk. He does not do this because he has thought through the physics of moisture and insulation. He does it because the lesson is in his body in the way that lessons learned from cold and distance and consequence tend to stay. Hannah's clothing follows the same logic at a different scale. She does not face the outdoor cold for extended periods. Her cold is the cold of a cabin that loses heat between fire feedings. The cold of a stone floor through thin shoe leather. The cold of the gap under the door on a hard wind day. Her outer layers are less about stopping the wind and more about holding consistent warmth across a range of temperatures. From the warm space near the fire to the genuinely cold space near the far wall and the door. A linen shift against the skin. Over that, a wool petticoat. Over that, a wool skirt. A wool bodice, a shawl on the coldest days, wrapped and pinned, so her arms are free to work. On her feet, wool stockings and leather shoes with a low heel that lifts the foot slightly off the cold floor. The shawl does something specific that a coat does not. It wraps and adjusts. Hannah can pull it tighter when she goes to the far end of the cabin and loosen it when she works close to the fire. It responds to where she is in the room at any given moment, rather than holding her at a fixed level of insulation regardless of what the moment requires. For a woman who spends the day moving between the warmest and coldest parts of the same room, this flexibility is worth more than a warmer but less responsive garment. She pins the shawl at her chest with a single pin she has had for 7 years. The children are dressed on the same principles at a smaller scale. Wool where they can tolerate it. Linen where they need the buffer. Mary wears a small wool cap inside on the coldest days, which she resists with the determination of a 4-year-old who has decided this is the thing she objects to. Hannah lets her take it off when the room is warm enough and puts it back when it is not. A negotiation that has been running since October and that neither of them will win before spring. The infant is wrapped tightly, not loosely, not in the way that looks comfortable to a modern eye. Tightly, in a way that creates a sealed system around a body that cannot generate enough heat to stay warm on its own. Linen nearest the skin. Over that, a small wool blanket, folded and wrapped. Over that, a larger piece of wool cloth. The whole assembly is checked regularly, because a wrap that has shifted can leave a gap, and a gap in an infant's wrapping at 0 degrees is a problem that requires immediate correction. Hannah checks the wrapping without thinking about it. It is part of every interaction with the infant, every feeding, every settling, part of the continuous management of a body that cannot manage itself. The clothes work, not perfectly, not on every day. Thomas comes inside some afternoons with his outer layers damp and his hands cold enough that he needs several minutes at the fire before they are fully functional. Hannah's feet are cold most of the winter, a condition she has accepted as the background state of her feet from November through March, and that she does not mention because mentioning it changes nothing. But the clothes hold the bodies inside them. They hold enough warmth to keep the work going, to keep the family functional, to keep the children growing and the infant breathing, and Thomas and Hannah upright and doing what needs doing. In 1725, in a one-room cabin in Connecticut, that is the whole purpose of what you put on in the morning. It is not about appearance. It is about making it to the evening with enough warmth left in your body to start again tomorrow. Robert Aldrich appears at the Wheeler door on the 3rd morning after the January storm. He does not send word ahead. There is no way to send word ahead when the snow between the 2 properties is 3 feet deep and the path that connects them has not been broken since the storm came in 2 days ago. He simply appears, working through the drifts in the stand of bare oak and birch that separates his clearing from the Wheelers. Moving with the deliberate pace of a man crossing difficult ground, because the ground is difficult and not for any other reason. Thomas sees him coming from the window. He goes to the door and opens it before Robert reaches the stoop. Robert looks at Thomas. He looks past Thomas into the cabin, at Hannah by the fire, at the children, at the cradle, at the smoke he can see rising from the chimney when he glances up, which tells him what he came to find out. His face does not change when he sees all of this, but something in his posture does. A small settling, the physical equivalent of a breath released. "Come in," Thomas says. Robert comes in. He stands near the door, rather than taking a stool. The posture of a man who has not come to stay. Hannah offers hot water from the pot. He takes the cup and holds it with both hands and drinks. They talk about the storm. Not in a dramatic way. In the way men who work outdoors talk about weather. Practically and specifically. With a shorthand of people who share a reference frame so complete that they do not need to explain most of what they say. The snowfall they estimate from the depth against known markers. The wind direction and what it means for the next few days. The state of the path to the mill in town, which Robert walked part of yesterday and found passable but slow. After perhaps 15 minutes, Robert sets the cup down. He asks about the infant. Hannah answers from across the room. "The baby is fine," she says. "The baby had a difficult night on the first night of the storm, when the cold came through the north wall harder than usual. But the baby is fine now." Robert nods. He picks up his hat. He says he will tell Sarah that everyone is well. Thomas walks him to the door, and they stand for a moment in the doorway looking at the clearing. At the snow sculpted up against the north side of the cabin and shallow on the south. At the woodpile, visible under its covering. Robert looks at the woodpile the same way Thomas looks at it. With the eye of a man who can read a stack from a distance and knows what the shape of it means. Neither of them says anything about it. Robert goes back through the trees. Thomas watches until he is out of sight and then closes the door. This is the full account of that visit. Nothing was resolved. Nothing changed hands. No crisis was averted by the conversation. And yet the visit is not nothing. And both men know it. And the knowing is the point. To understand what Robert Aldrich's visit actually was, you have to understand what community meant in the New England of 1725, which is something different from what the word usually suggests. Community, in this time and place, was not primarily social, it was structural. It was load-bearing. It was part of the system of survival in the same way that the woodpile and the root cellar and the layered blankets were part of the system. A redundancy built into colonial life, not through any formal planning, but through the accumulated understanding of what happened to families that did not have it. The colonial townships of New England were organized around this understanding in ways visible in their physical layout. The earliest settlers placed their houses within sight or shouting distance of each other, even when there was ample land to spread out. Later, as townships filled in and land was divided and second and third generations moved toward the edges of cleared territory, houses spread further apart. But the network of mutual obligation that developed in the early years did not disappear. It changed form. It became the particular awareness that Thomas has of the Aldriches. The kind of awareness that does not require constant contact because it is based on pattern. The normal pattern of smoke from Robert's chimney at different times of day. The normal pattern of his tracks in the snow when he moves between the cabin and the woodlot. A deviation from either of these patterns. A morning with no smoke. A path that has not been broken on a day when it should have been, means putting on your coat and going. This is what smoke from a chimney means in the 1720s. It means the fire is burning, The fire burning means the family is there and functioning, and the night was survivable. No smoke means you go. And you go without deliberating about it. Because the deliberation itself is a form of lateness. There are other forms of mutual support that run through the winter without the drama of emergency. Sarah Aldrich and Hannah Wheeler share knowledge. Not in any structured or formal way, but when they see each other. At the church service, the township holds when weather allows. In the occasional visit when conditions permit. They talk about the things that women in their situation talk about. How to make the salt pork last longer in the final weeks. What to do for a child's chest cough when the remedies you have are not working well enough. How to manage the nursing when your own body is running low on what it needs. How to patch a gap in a wool garment with the material you actually have rather than the material you wish you had. This knowledge does not get written down anywhere. It travels from woman to woman, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, accumulated over decades of winters and refined by the specific conditions of New England cold and colonial scarcity. It is as important to the survival of these families as the woodpile and the root cellar, and possibly more important, because you can run out of wood and work your way through the crisis with your hands. But a mother who does not know how to keep a nursing infant fed through a hard winter is in a situation where the missing resource is knowledge itself, and you cannot chop that out of the forest. Hannah learned most of what she knows about managing a colonial household from two women. Her mother, who raised her in a household not very different from this one, and a neighbor from her first winter in this cabin, an older woman who had been in the territory for 30 years and who had the particular quality of knowledge that 30 New England winters produce, comprehensive and unsentimental and entirely practical, oriented toward what works rather than what is supposed to work. That woman died 4 winters ago. Hannah still applies what she learned from her every day in the management of the fire and the food and the children and the continuous small decisions that running this household through winter requires. The knowledge did not die with the woman. It passed, the way it always passed, from one person to the next, through proximity and attention, and the particular seriousness of someone who understands that what they are learning is not interesting, but necessary. A family completely isolated in a New England winter of this period is not in a romantic situation. They are in a dangerous one. The dangers are specific. A fire that gets out of hand. An injury to the adult who does the outdoor work. The wrong moment with an axe. The wrong step on a frozen path. The kind of accident that in summer is painful and in winter, with help half a mile away, through deep snow and the cabin temperature dropping by the hour, becomes something else entirely. A sickness that takes down both adults before either can adequately tend the fire or manage the food or keep the children safe. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They are the scenarios that colonial families knew about because they had happened to people they knew or people their parents had known. And the knowledge of them is part of what drives Robert Aldrich through 3 feet of snow on the 3rd morning after a storm, to stand at the Wheeler door and look past Thomas into the room and see Hannah at the fire and the children and the cradle, and let his posture do that small settling thing. Everyone here. Fire burning. The night was survivable. He picks up his hat and goes home and tells Sarah. On a Sunday in late January, when the weather has settled enough to allow it. Thomas and Hannah bundle the children and walk to the township meeting house for the weekly service. The walk takes 40 minutes through the cold. They arrive with their faces red and their outer layers stiff, and they sit in the meeting house, which is not warm, but is warmer than outside, and which has the particular warmth of 30 or 40 people gathered in a space built for more. Thomas speaks to Robert and two other men from neighboring farms about the state of the road and the depth of the remaining winter. Hannah speaks to Sarah about the infant, who is now nearly 4 months old, and steadily and visibly, the face filling out, the limbs thickening. Sarah looks at the baby with the careful eye of a woman who knows what to look for. She nods. "The baby is doing well," she says. Hannah says yes. This is not small talk. This is two women conducting an assessment in the only setting currently available to them, using the accumulated knowledge of everyone who has looked at a winter infant in this territory before them, and arriving at a conclusion that matters. The baby is doing well. They walk home through the cold, all 5 of them, and the cabin appears at the edge of the clearing with smoke rising from its chimney. Because Eli was old enough to be left with the fire for 2 hours, and the fire is still burning, which is the thing Thomas was thinking about on the entire walk to the meeting house and the entire walk back. He opens the door. Eli looks up from where he is sitting near the hearth. Thomas looks at the fire, then at his son. He takes off his coat and hangs it on the peg and says nothing, and the family comes inside and the door closes, and the cold stays on the other side of it where the cold belongs. On a Wednesday morning in the middle of January, Eli Wheeler wakes up and does not get up. This is noticed immediately. In a one-room cabin, where 5 people move through their mornings in a pattern that has been established over months, a child who does not get up is a fact that registers before anyone has consciously processed it. Hannah knows before she crosses the room. She knows from the quality of his stillness, which is not the stillness of a child who is comfortable and choosing to stay down, but the particular stillness of a child whose body has decided that staying down is the right response to its current situation. She puts her hand on his forehead. He is warm, not the warmth of a child who has been sleeping under blankets near a fire. The deeper warmth, that means the body has shifted its internal temperature upward for reasons of its own. She does not say anything to Thomas yet. She does what she does first when a child is sick, which is to look and listen before drawing any conclusion. She checks his eyes when he opens them, the clarity or cloudiness that tells her something about where the illness is. She asks where he hurts, his throat and his head. He says. She feels along his throat with 2 fingers, the glands below the jaw, checking for swelling. She asks him to open his mouth and looks in the firelight at the back of his throat, checking for the signs she is most watching for. The throat is red. There are no white patches. She covers him with the quilt and stands up. Thomas is watching from across the room. She tells him Eli is sick, a fever and a sore throat. Thomas notes, taking in the information the way he takes in most practical information, filing it against what it means for the day and the days ahead. Eli sick means Eli cannot carry the morning wood. It means the cabin needs to stay warmer than usual because a feverish child loses heat faster than a healthy one. It means Hannah's attention is divided in ways that cost her in other areas. None of this is said out loud. All of it is understood. There is no doctor within reach. This fact sits at the center of everything that follows, and it is important to understand clearly. The nearest physician is a day's travel in good conditions. In January, the journey takes longer and costs more physically, and at the end of it, a colonial physician of the 1720s brings the knowledge of his period, which was genuine and often effective, and also, by the standards of later centuries, limited. Bleeding, purging, specific herbal preparations, close observation, warmth and fluids. There was no certain treatment for most of what made children sick in this period. There was care, and there was time, and there was whatever knowledge the people in the room could bring to bear. What Hannah has is this: dried herbs gathered and hung in the summer, bundled and kept from the damp, elderberries, dried, which she knows from her mother, make a tea that women in this territory have long believed helps with fevers and throat ailments. Whatever the precise mechanism, the belief was old enough and widespread enough to carry weight. Dried thyme for throat troubles, a small amount of honey in a sealed pot, kept carefully, because honey is expensive, and because it soothes a raw throat in a way that warm water alone does not. She makes the tea. She adds the honey. She makes Eli drink it slowly, sitting up, because a child lying flat with a sore throat does not swallow comfortably. He makes a face at the taste. She tells him to drink it anyway. There was no certainty in any of this. Only observation and care and warmth and fluids, and the particular watchfulness of a mother who has learned to read the small changes in a sick child the way Thomas reads the small changes in the fire. Whether the elderberry tea helped or whether time was doing the work, she could not have said. She gave it because giving it was something she could do. And in a cabin with a sick child and no other options, doing something is better than doing nothing. When doing nothing means only waiting, she keeps the fire higher than usual. This is a cost Thomas feels without mentioning. Another weight added to the calculation: he has been running about the woodpile. A feverish child in a cold room recovers more slowly than a feverish child in a warm one. And slow recovery means more days of extra fire, which over the long run costs more than the accelerated burning of keeping the room adequately warm from the start. Hannah knows this equation. She feeds the fire without asking Thomas about it, because asking Thomas about it would make the cost real in a way that changes nothing about the decision. The nursing of Eli over the next 4 days happens alongside everything else the cabin requires. This is the part that the record of colonial illness never captures. The part that is invisible, because it happens in the gaps of everything else. A sick child in a colonial cabin does not suspend the operation of the cabin. The other children still need feeding. The infant still needs nursing. Thomas still needs to come in from the cold and have something warm and have his damp outer layers hung to dry. The fire still needs managing every few hours, regardless of whether Eli is sleeping well or badly. Hannah sleeps less during these 4 days. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of a person sitting up through the night in vigil. In the practical way of a person whose night checks, already fragmented by the infant and the fire, now include checking on Eli. And the checks on Eli are more frequent than for a healthy child, because the signs she is watching for can change overnight. Thomas is aware of all of this. He takes Mary outside for longer stretches in the afternoon so the cabin is quieter. He feeds the fire himself on the second night so that Hannah can sleep through once without being the one to get up. And he does this without telling her he is going to do it. And she does not know until morning that he did. He does not tell her. She figures it out when she wakes and realizes she slept longer than she has slept in 4 days. And she looks at Thomas, and he is already looking at the fire. And that is the whole conversation they have about it. On the morning of the 4th day, Eli's fever breaks. Not in a moment. Gradually, the way recovery actually happens. The child waking up slightly less warm than the night before. Then at midday, slightly less again. The body finding its way back to its normal temperature across the course of a full day rather than in any single hour. Hannah checks his forehead in the morning, at midday, and again in the evening. Normal. She gives him a small bowl of broth from the pot. Warm and salty. The kind of food that goes into a body that has been fighting and needs to start coming back. He sits up on his pallet and drinks it and asks about the weather outside. What the temperature is? Whether there is new snow. The 7-year-old curiosity back in his face, like a window that had been closed for 4 days and is now open again. Thomas comes in that afternoon and sees Eli sitting up. He crosses the room and puts his hand on the back of his son's neck. Briefly, the way you put your hand on something to check its temperature, and also to confirm that it is there and that it is all right. And then he goes to hang his coat. Hannah turns back to the fire. The infant is in the cradle, sleeping with the deep, untroubled sleep of a baby who has come through the past 4 days untouched by what moved through the cabin around it. This is the thing Hannah was most afraid of. A sick child in a one-room cabin is a sick child whose illness moves freely through the air that everyone breathes. And a 4-month-old who got what Eli had would have been in a far more serious situation than a 7-year-old. She watched the infant through all 4 days with a watchfulness underneath her watchfulness, checking for warmth, for feeding, for the changes in breathing or behavior that would have told her the illness had moved. It did not move. She does not make any ceremony of this. She notes it the way she notes things that need to be noted, and goes back to the pot. The work of the cabin does not pause to acknowledge the things that did not happen, only the things that did. On the 5th morning, Eli gets up and carries wood in from the pile by the door without being asked. Thomas, coming in from outside with frost on his coat, sees this. He sits down on his stool. He looks at the fire for a long moment. Something lives in this moment that neither Thomas nor Hannah will ever put into words. Not to each other, and not to anyone else, because the language for it does not exist in their world, and because the putting of such things into words is not the habit of people who live the way they live. But it is there, the particular quality of a morning when something that could have gone wrong did not go wrong, and the family is in the room, and the fire is burning, and the child who was sick is carrying wood. The fire burns. Eli stacks the wood he carried. The morning moves on. On a morning in early February, Eli Wheeler wakes before his parents. Not because anyone told him to, not because something in the room startled him awake. He simply opens his eyes in the gray pre-dawn dark and lies there for a moment, listening to the breathing around him. And then something in him decides the moment is right, and he gets up. He crosses to the fireplace in his stocking feet, moving with the careful quiet of a child who has spent months learning how to move through a sleeping room without producing the sounds that wake people. Not taught this, learned it. The way you learn the things a small space teaches you, through the consequences of getting it wrong enough times that your body adjusts without being asked. He crouches in front of the hearth. The coals are there, low but present. The deep orange of a fire that has been holding through the night and is still viable but will not last another hour without attention. He has seen his father red a fire this way hundreds of times. The crouch, the look, the small adjustments of position to see the coal bed from the right angle in the dark. He picks up 2 pieces of wood from the pile beside the hearth. He lays them across the coals, the way he has watched his father lay them. Not flat, but angled, leaving space between them for the air to move through. Because wood laid flat against wood, with no gap, is wood that smothers what it is supposed to feed. He blows on the coals once, twice, steady and low. The long, patient breath his father uses rather than a sharp puff. The wood catches. He stays crouched and watches the flame move from the uncertain flicker of a new catch to the steadier burn of wood that has committed to burning. Then he stands up and goes back to his pallet and lies down. His father wakes 20 minutes later. Thomas crosses to the fireplace and finds it burning well. He stands there for a moment, looking at the fire, and then he looks at Eli, who is lying on the pallet with his eyes open. Thomas looks at the fire again, and then at his son again. He says nothing. He goes to add a larger piece of wood to what Eli started, and the morning begins. This is the education the cabin provides. It does not happen in a schoolroom, because the township school runs in the warmer months and not in the depths of winter when distances are difficult and children are needed at home. It does not happen through formal instruction in most cases, not through the deliberate sitting down of a parent with a child to explain a principle and then test whether the child has understood it. It happens through proximity and repetition, and the particular learning that takes place when a child watches an adult do a real thing in a real situation with real consequences, for long enough that the watching becomes knowing without anyone deciding that is what is happening. Eli has watched his father tend the fire for 2 full winters. He has watched him bank it at night and rebuild it in the morning and feed it through the day and read its state from across the room and make adjustments so small and quick they barely register as actions. He has watched the fire not as a student watching a lesson, but as a person who lives beside it and depends on it, which is the position that produces genuine understanding rather than the superficial understanding of someone learning a thing as information separate from any real stake in the outcome. He knows the fire now. Not in every dimension his father knows it. Not with the full knowledge of a man who has been responsible for keeping a fire through many New England winters. But in the foundational way, the way you need to know it before any refinement can be added. And that foundational knowledge is now his to keep. Mary learns differently. She is 4. And what 4 does is watch and absorb without the layer of application that 7 has. She does not yet do the tasks. She does the precursors of the tasks, the positioning and the attention and the beginning of physical habits that will eventually become competence. She stands near Hannah when Hannah stirs the pot, close enough to see into it, and Hannah lets her stand there without moving her away. She watches the ladle make its slow circles. She watches the steam. She watches her mother's hand on the handle, the particular grip, the particular pace. She will not stir that pot this winter. She will stir it next winter, or the one after. And when she does, she will not need to be taught the grip, because her body will already carry it. From all this watching, from the way physical knowledge moves through the eyes before it moves through the hands, the cabin teaches the children not a curriculum, but a set of understandings about the physical world, so fundamental to survival in this place and time, that the children absorb them the way they absorb language, not as lessons, but as the structure of reality, as they know it. Fire requires attention. Inattention has consequences. Cold is a condition to be managed, not a complaint to be made. You dress for it and work through it, and you do not stop because of it. Food is finite. What is in the cellar is what there is, and what is there has to last. And the distance between what is there and what is needed is a calculation that runs in the background of every meal. Work does not stop because you would prefer it to stop. The water needs fetching whether you feel like fetching it or not. None of this is delivered as instruction. It is delivered as the shape of the days these children are living. And the children receive it the way all children receive the fundamental conditions of their world, as simply the way things are, unmeasured against any other possibility. There is an evening in early February worth stopping on. Eli asks his father why they do not make the cabin bigger. He has been thinking about this for a while, turning the problem over during the hours when his hands were busy with other things. The smallness of the cabin is not new to him. He has always known the cabin is small. But this winter, for reasons he cannot fully articulate, the smallness has become something he is thinking about, rather than simply experiencing. Thomas considers the question with the seriousness a man gives, a child who is genuinely asking rather than simply making noise. He explains, "A bigger cabin needs more wood to heat. A bigger cabin takes more time to build than they have had. And a bigger cabin built too quickly with gaps that cannot be properly chinked because the work was rushed will be colder than the smaller cabin they have now, which is small enough that one fire can do its job." The size of the cabin and the size of the fire are part of the same calculation. He explains this in the words of a man talking to his son about the place where they live, practical and specific. Eli thinks about this. Then he says, "So the small size is part of why we are warm." Thomas says, "That is not exactly right, but it is not exactly wrong either." This is the honest answer. The acknowledgement that reality is more complicated than the simple version, but that the simple version is still worth understanding as a starting point. Eli files this in the same place he files everything he is learning this winter, the place where understanding accumulates into something that will eventually become the knowledge of a man who has lived in this territory long enough to know it as his father knows it. Mary, who has been moving her wooden spool across the floor during this conversation, does not ask any questions. She simply continues moving the spool. But she was listening. Thomas can tell she was listening from the quality of her silence during the explanation, the particular stillness of a child who is taking something in rather than simply being quiet. On a gray afternoon near the end of February, all three children are in the cabin at the same time. Thomas is outside. Hannah is at the fire. Eli is at the table with a piece of charcoal and a flat board, making marks in the private notation system he has been developing for weeks, a system that means something to him and that he has not explained to anyone. Hannah has seen the marks. She has not asked about them. She asked once and received an answer that answered the question without fully answering it, and she did not ask again. Because some things in this cabin belong to the person they happen to. Mary is on the floor near the fire with her spool. The infant is in the cradle, awake, looking up at the ceiling, with the concentrated, unfocused attention of a baby, discovering that the world has a ceiling and that the ceiling changes when the fire below it shifts. The fire pops once. Mary looks at it. Eli looks at it. The infant turns its head slightly in the direction of the sound. Then all three return to what they were doing. This moment passes without remark, without ceremony, without anyone noting that something has happened. But something has. 3 children in a one-room cabin in February, each at a different stage of learning the same world, each building on what came before, each carrying something forward that cannot be purchased or found in any store, in any town in New England in 1725. The knowledge of how to be here, how to stay warm in this place, how to pay attention to the things that require paying attention to, how to keep the fire. Thomas comes in at dusk, stamping snow from his boots. He looks at the children. He takes off his coat. He sits down. Hannah brings him a cup of hot water from the pot. Outside, the last light is gone, and the cold settles into the deep cold of a February night, and the first stars show in the strip of sky visible through the window. Inside, the fire burns, all of them here. On a morning in the last week of January, Thomas Wheeler walks to the south side of the cabin and looks at what remains of the woodpile. He looks at it for a long time. He does not touch it. He does not pull a log from the interior to check the dryness or restack anything. He stands in the cold morning with his coat on and his hat pulled down, and he looks at the shape of the stack under its covering of snow, at the places where the ends of the logs show and give him the dimensional information he is working out in his head. He has been working it out in his head for a week, turning it over in the background of everything else. The way a man turns over a problem he does not want to look at directly, checking the numbers from different angles and arriving at the same place each time and not saying anything because saying it does not change it, and because he is not yet ready to be certain. He turns and looks at the sky. The sky to the northwest has the color that means more snow is coming. The particular flat, white gray that is different from ordinary overcast. The sky of weather that has committed to arriving somewhere between 12 and 24 hours. He goes back inside. He sits on his stool with his cup of hot water and looks at the fire and runs the arithmetic one more time. But a fire is burning well this morning because he fed it well. It will burn well all day if Hannah feeds it at the right intervals. The problem is not today. The problem is the rate. And the rate is wrong. In a normal January, the fire consumes a predictable amount of wood per day, an amount he has measured across enough winters to carry as a reliable internal estimate. This January has not been normal. The 4 days of Eli's illness pushed the fire higher and kept it there. More wood burned in a shorter period than a healthy month would have required. The two major storms brought extra burning on the days when the wind drove cold through the walls harder than usual. And the past 2 weeks have been colder than his October estimate accounted for. Cold in a sustained way, rather than a cold snap followed by relief. The kind of cold that does not give the cabin time to recover between feedings. He does the arithmetic one final time. At the current rate, with no additional severe weather and no further illness requiring extra heat, he has enough wood to reach approximately the first week of March. The realistic heating end date, the point at which Connecticut weather reliably permits a lower fire, is somewhere in the last week of March or the first week of April, 3 to 4 weeks of gap. He sets the cup down. Hannah is at the fire with her back to him, managing the pot. The infant in the cradle to her left. She heard him come in from outside, and she heard him sit down, and she has been aware, in the way Hannah is aware of most things in this cabin, that he came in not with the straightforward movement of a man who went to do a task and has returned from completing it, but with the particular quality of a man who went to look at something and came back still looking at it in his mind. She does not turn around. She waits. He says, "I need to cut more." She says, "How much more?" He says, 3 weeks, maybe 4. She is quiet for a moment. She is doing her own version of the arithmetic. The arithmetic of what 3 or 4 weeks of additional cutting means in practical terms. Thomas going out in the cold for extended periods every day for the next several weeks. Cutting and hauling in conditions that are already hard. Thomas coming in exhausted, which means Thomas eating more, which touches her own calculation about the food. Thomas working through whatever weather the next month brings, including the storm that is building right now to the northwest. She says, "The storm." He says, "I know." She turns around. They look at each other across the room with the look of two people who have been managing a difficult situation together long enough that the look contains most of what needs to be said. She is not angry. He is not defensive. There is no version of this moment where either of them has simply failed, because the winter has been harder and colder than last year, and slightly harder than his best estimate. And a harder winter than your best estimate is not a planning failure. It is January in Connecticut. It is the condition of this life, and they both know it. She says, "Wait until after the storm. The new snow will make the going harder, and you will come back wet and tired. And that is not worth the half-day gained." He considers this. She is right about the timing of things more often than he is, and he has learned to take this seriously. Not as a concession, but as the practical recognition of where her judgment is better than his. He says, "I will wait." She turns back to the fire. The storm comes that night. It runs for 18 hours. Not the worst storm of the winter, but serious. The kind that deposits 2 feet of new snow and then stops with the abruptness of New England weather that has finished what it came to do. Thomas is inside for the duration. He splits the wood that is stacked just inside the door into smaller pieces to make it last longer. A technique that works because smaller pieces have more surface area and catch faster, and allow the fire to be managed at a lower level without dying. He does not explain to Hannah why he is doing this, because she already knows. Eli watches his father work the wood inside. He watches the technique, the angle of the blade, the placement of each piece, the particular tap that starts the split before the full swing that finishes it. He files this alongside everything else he has been filing this winter. The storm ends on the second morning. Thomas goes out. The path to the woodlot is buried. He breaks through it himself, step by step, lifting his feet through snow that comes to his knee in the shallower stretches and higher in the drifts. This costs more physically than walking the path in clear weather. The particular exhaustion of lifting your legs against resistance over and over for a quarter mile, and he is already tired from the confinement of 2 days inside before he reaches the trees. He cuts for 4 hours. He takes dead standing timber he marked in the fall, wood that has been drying on the stump and will burn better than freshly cut green wood. He does not have the luxury of fighting poor quality fuel in the last weeks of winter. His hands inside the mittens are cold enough by the 3rd hour that he stops twice and stands with his fists pressed against his coat below the ribs, where the body holds its warmth longest, waiting for the feeling to return to his fingers before picking up the axe again. He does not allow himself to think about the gap between what he is cutting and what the arithmetic says he still needs. He thinks about the next tree. He thinks about the angle of the cut and the quality of the wood and whether the piece will split clean. He thinks about what is in front of him, because what is in front of him is the only part of this problem he can do anything about right now. He drags the cut logs back toward the cabin on the wooden sledge, loading it with what it will carry, and making 2 trips through the path he broke in the morning snow. His back is tight from the cutting and the loading. His face, the only part of him exposed to the air for 4 hours, has the rawness of cold burned skin that will be tender to the touch tonight. He stacks the new wood against the cabin wall. He goes inside. Hannah looks at him when he comes through the door. The quick assessment of a woman who needs to know what condition the person coming in from a difficult afternoon is actually in. She hands him the water cup without being asked. He sits down. His hands around the cup are cold enough that the heat of it is close to painful against his palms, the pins and needles of warmth returning to tissue that has been cold too long. He drinks. How much? Hannah says. Enough for 2.5 weeks? He says. Maybe 3, if the weather gives us a mild stretch. She nods. She goes back to the pot. He sits with the cup and looks at the fire, which Hannah has been holding at the right level through the day. Lower than the morning peak, but steady. The correct level. For an afternoon, when the storm has passed and the cabin has reached the temperature it will hold until evening. He does not tell her the number he is not saying, the number that represents the gap between what he brought in today and what he will still need if March arrives cold. He has not said this number out loud because saying it does not change it, and because Hannah is running her own version of the same calculation with the food in the cellar. And they both know what the last weeks of winter look like. And they have been here before. Not this exact moment, but this kind of moment. The place in the winter where the preparation meets the reality, and you find out how closely they match. They have gotten through it before. He sets the cup down. He gets up and goes to the door and looks outside at the new wood stacked against the wall, at the specific volume of it in the failing afternoon light, at what his eye reads without needing to count. Then he comes back inside. He picks up the cup again, even though it is empty. Hannah sees this. She takes it without a word and fills it again from the pot and hands it back. He holds it with both hands. 3 weeks. He thinks, maybe more, if March is kind. March has been kind before. He does not say this out loud either. He drinks the water and looks at the fire, and outside the temperature is dropping again with the clearing sky. The particular cold that follows a storm, when the clouds that provided their own thin insulation have moved on, and the bare sky lets the heat out into the dark above without anything to hold it back. Inside the cabin the fire holds. The new wood is against the wall. Thomas stays where he is, cup in both hands, the warmth of it moving slowly into his palms. He stays there until the warmth is all the way in. Hannah Wheeler goes down through the cellar hatch on a morning in the third week of February, before anyone else in the cabin is awake. She does not take the candle. She has not needed the candle to navigate this cellar since November. She goes down the 4 wooden steps in the dark and stands on the earthen floor and lets the cold settle around her. And she does what she came to do, which is to look at what is left with her own eyes rather than with the number she has been carrying in her head. Sometimes the number and the looking are the same. This morning she needs them to be the same. The first barrel of salt pork is empty, has been empty since the first week of February. The second barrel is not empty, but she can feel the bottom of it when she reaches her hand down through the brine. The cold wood of the barrel floor closer than it should be at this point in the winter. Perhaps 8 pieces of pork remaining. Perhaps 10, if she is generous in her counting. Each one enough for one meal if she is careful about the portions. She is going to need to be careful now, in a way she has not needed to be careful until now. She moves to the beans. 1 sack remains of the 3 she put down in October. The cloth gone soft from handling, and the sack is perhaps a third full, enough for another 2 weeks if beans carry the meal rather than accompany it. She moves to the cornmeal crock and opens it and puts her hand inside and feels the level, the way she has been doing every few days since December, tracking the descent. The sides of the crock are visible when she tilts it. She knows what that means without calculating it out. The apples, 6 remain of the 4 dozen she wrapped in September. She has been saving them without saying to herself that she is saving them, pulling from everything else first, leaving the apples in their straw. Because the apples are the one thing in this cellar that still carries the taste of something other than salt and dried grain, that still holds in its flavor the memory of the orchard in September, the warm light, the smell of the harvest, the world before the snow came and made the world small. She will save them 1 more week. Then she will use them. She stands in the cellar longer than she needs to, not because there is anything left to assess, because she is doing something she rarely allows herself to do in this winter, which is to hold the full weight of the situation without immediately moving to the next task, without converting the feeling into a calculation or an action plan or a list of adjustments. She is a woman who manages things. She has been managing things since November. She is very good at it, and she knows she is good at it, and most of the time, the managing is what keeps her going. But it is the 3rd week of February, and she is standing in a cellar that is running out, and outside the ground is still frozen solid, and the snow is still knee-deep at the south edge of the clearing, and the garden will not be plantable for 6 weeks at the earliest, and her body is thinner than it was in November, and tired in the particular way of a body that has been doing too much on too little for too long. She allows herself to know this for a moment. Then she goes back up. The lean weeks in a colonial New England winter are not a dramatic event. They are a structural condition, designed into the system from the beginning. The inevitable gap between the stored food of autumn and the new food of spring. Every family that survived a New England winter long enough to have children who survived, it passed down the knowledge of this gap, what it felt like, and how to move through it. The same way they passed down the knowledge of how to bank a fire, and how to pack a root cellar, and how to read the sky for weather. You knew it was coming. Knowing did not make it easier. It made it manageable, which is a different thing. Thomas feels it in his back. He has felt it building for 3 weeks. The slow stiffening of a body doing outdoor work in hard cold on food that is slightly less than the work requires. He does not mention it. Mentioning it would not add to the food supply or shorten the winter. And Thomas Wheeler does not make a habit of giving voice to the things he cannot change. Hannah feels it differently. She is still nursing, which means the demand on her body is a demand that comes before her own comfort or her own sufficiency. And she has been managing this since November by eating enough to keep the milk coming without drawing more than she should from the family's overall supply. This calculation has worked. The infant is nearly 5 months old now and gaining weight in the steady way of a well-fed baby. The face fuller than it was in the fall. The limbs thicker. The wakefulness longer and more alert. The infant has come through the lean weeks on the far side of Hannah's careful management of her own body. The toll of this on Hannah is visible in the sharpness of her face. The way her collarbones show more clearly than they did in October. The way her hands look at the end of a long day. Thomas has noticed. He has not said anything. There is nothing to say that would help. What he can do is what he does. One evening in the last week of February at supper, when Hannah portions out the food with the matter-of-fact efficiency she brings to this task every night, and her own bowl receives less than the others. A small reduction in the pour that she makes without calling attention to it. The ladle tilting back slightly earlier over her bowl than over his. The children do not notice. Thomas notices. He reaches across and lifts the ladle from the pot and adds a portion to her bowl. Enough to make it level with his own. He does not say anything. He simply moves the food and sets the ladle back down. She looks at him. He looks at his bowl. She does not give it back. They eat. This moment passes with no words around it, and that is how it will stay. Because it is not a dramatic gesture, and was not meant as one. It is a man doing the arithmetic, and finding that his wife's sufficiency matters more than an equal division of a smaller quantity, and making a small physical correction to the equation without ceremony. The way Thomas makes most corrections to things that need correcting in this cabin. Eli watches this from across the table without appearing to watch. He is 7 years old, in a world that does not shield 7-year-olds from understanding what they live inside of. And he understands more of what he has just seen than either of his parents would guess. He says nothing. He finishes his bowl and asks to be excused, and goes to his pallet and lies on his back looking at the ceiling in the particular way he looks at things he is processing. And eventually his breathing slows. The days are getting longer. This is real and measurable. A few minutes of additional light each day. And by the 3rd week of February, the change has become something you can feel rather than just observe. The dark that arrived at 4 in the afternoon in December arrives now a little past 4, and then a little past that, each day, making a small deposit in the account of light that the winter has been drawing against since November. Thomas and Hannah both feel this shift the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something in the body before it reaches the mind. But the ground is still frozen. The garden is buried under packed snow. The trees at the edge of the clearing show no signs of swelling buds. The pond is still solid, has been solid since December. And while Thomas fishes through the ice when the effort is worth the cold, the fish are slow in cold water and the supplement is modest. The forest has nothing to offer yet. No greens, no early plants. None of the things that will come in April and May and make the table different again. Everything is coming. Nothing is here yet. This is the lean weeks. And the lean weeks require an endurance that is different from the acute endurance of a crisis. There is no emergency to respond to, no specific action that resolves the situation. There is only the holding on, the management of what remains, the calculation of how to make the last of the stored food reach the first of the new growth without running the family into a deficit too large to function inside of. Hannah makes the bean soup thinner, not obviously thinner, not in a way that announces itself as rationing, thinner in the way a skilled cook stretches something without making the stretching visible. More water, more time on the fire to develop whatever flavor the reduced ingredients can still produce. A scraping of the lard crock that adds richness without adding much volume. The family eats it, and it is warm, and it is food, and it is enough to keep the work going. She uses one of the apples. She cores it and slices it thin and adds it to the morning porridge. And the smell of it cooking is so different from the smells that have filled this cabin since November that all 3 older children turn their heads when it reaches the air. The particular bright smell of apple, warm and sweet. The smell of a season that feels very far away right now. Mary asks what the smell is. Hannah tells here. Mary says she wants more. Hannah says this is all there is this morning. Mary accepts this with the acceptance of a 4-year-old who has learned, across the months of this winter, that when her mother states a limit clearly and calmly, it is a real limit and not an opening for negotiation. The apple smell will be here tomorrow morning and the morning after that, and then it will not be here anymore. And Mary does not know this. And it is not necessary that she know. There are 5 apples left. On a late afternoon near the end of February, Thomas comes inside and sits down and does not immediately reach for the water cup. He sits with his hands on his knees and looks at the middle distance the way he looks at things when his body needs a moment before the next thing. Hannah sets the cup on the table beside him. He picks it up. He says, quietly, as if he is not entirely certain he believes it. Yet, the maples are running. She turns from the fire. On the south-facing slope, where the afternoon sun reaches longest. The small cut he made in a maple trunk last week as a test has sap in it today. Not much. Thin and cold, and barely a trickle. But running? Hannah stands at the fire looking at him. The maples running does not mean spring. It does not mean the snow is going, or the ground is thawing, or the food problem is solved, or the cold is finished. The maple sap runs when the days are above freezing and the nights are still below it. A pattern that belongs to the shoulder between winter and spring. A pattern that can arrive in late February and disappear again for another 2 weeks of hard cold before it comes back for good. But the maple's running means the shoulder is here, means the winter has reached the part of itself where the days are beginning to pull against the cold rather than surrendering to it. Means that what has been endured is mostly endured. She sits down across the table from him. They sit with their cups in the late day quiet of the cabin when the children are occupied and the fire is at its steady afternoon level and the work of the day is mostly done. The same table they have sat across all winter. The same fire in the same corner. The same low ceiling and the same smoky smell in every surface of the room. Thomas and Hannah are not the same as they were in October. They are thinner. They are tired in the deep way of people who have been managing a hard thing for a long time without a break from the managing. Their hands are rougher. Their faces are sharper at the edges. The winter is in them in the specific physical way that a New England winter gets into people who live inside it rather than insulated from it. They have gotten through, not finished. The last weeks of winter lie ahead, and a New England March can be generous or brutal, and sometimes both within the same week. They are not done, but the maples are running. That is enough for this afternoon. That is what there is. And they sit with it. And it is enough. Thomas Wheeler hears the dripping before he is fully awake. It comes from above, from the roof. A sound so different from any sound the cabin has made in 5 months that it takes him a moment in the early gray of waking to understand what he is hearing. The snow on the roof is melting, not in any dramatic way, not in the sudden give of a heavy load releasing all at once, but steadily, the particular drip of water finding its way off the edge of the overhang and falling to the ground below. Irregular, but continuous. The sound of something that has been frozen for a long time and is now, in the simplest way, letting go. He lies there and listens to it. He does not get up right away. This is unusual. Thomas Wheeler does not lie in bed listening to things in the morning. He is a man of early and specific actions. The fire, the water, the door check, the sequence the winter installed in him in November, and that has run without interruption since. But this morning something holds him in the bed past the moment he would normally be moving. Some quality in the sound from the roof, or in the quality of the light coming through the window, which is different this morning. The light is different. Not dramatically, not in any way he could put into words if someone asked him to. But the light coming through the oiled paper of the window on this April morning has something in it that the light of February and March did not have. Something in the angle of it, the way it enters the room higher and more directly than it has for months, the way it reaches the far wall in a place it has not reached since October. He gets up. He goes to the fireplace and finds the overnight coals still viable, barely, the orange deep in the gray ash, and he builds the fire up with the same sequence he has used every morning of this winter. Thin pieces first. Blow steadily. Wait for the catch. Add the larger piece when the smaller ones have committed to burning. The fire takes. He crosses to the door. He opens it. This is the same action he has performed every morning of this winter. The opening of the door to check the weather and the temperature and the state of the world outside. He has opened it in the dark of January, at 3 a.m, when the cold outside had physical weight. He has opened it in storms, that pushed snow through the gap before he could get it closed. He has opened it on the bright, brittle mornings of February that looked like spring from inside and were not. He opens it on this April morning. The air that comes in is cold. This is April in Connecticut, and April does not apologize for cold mornings. But it is a different cold. A cold that has a ceiling to it. A cold that the sun, already climbing above the tree line, is working against rather than reinforcing. He can smell in the air something that has been absent since October. The smell of earth. The dark mineral smell of ground beginning to release the winter from its surface. Gradually, and without ceremony, he stands in the doorway. The clearing in front of the cabin is still mostly white. 5 months of snow have compacted into a dense layer that will not go quickly. That will need weeks of above-freezing days to release completely. But at the south edge of the clearing, where the sun reaches longest and earliest, the ground is showing through in patches, the dark soil visible beneath the white, and the sight of it is larger than it should be. The way small things are sometimes larger than they should be after a long deprivation. He stands there long enough that Hannah, waking to the sound of the open door and the changed quality of the air coming into the cabin, gets up and comes to stand beside him. She looks at the clearing, at the patches of dark ground at the south edge, at the dripping from the roof above them, at the sky, which is the pale blue of an early April morning, high and clear, with a quality of light in it that has been absent for 5 months. She does not say anything. He does not say anything. They stand in the open doorway and look at the world outside the cabin. And the cold air comes in around them, and neither of them moves back from it. Behind them in the cabin, Eli wakes, and the sound of a 7-year-old waking up. The brief reorientation, the feet hitting the floor, is the same sound it has been every morning of this winter. Familiar in the way the sounds of people you have lived closely with for months become part of the texture of every day. He comes to the doorway. He looks past his parents at the clearing. He looks at the dark patches of earth at the south edge. He goes down the steps, not running, walking, with the deliberate quality of a child who is not sure yet how much has changed and wants to find out carefully rather than assume. He crosses the clearing to the south edge where the ground is showing and crouches down and looks at the dark soil for a moment. He puts his hand on it. He stays there with his palm flat against the earth, feeling the particular cold, wet temperature of ground that has spent the winter frozen and is now thawing from the top down. Still cold, but not the cold of ice. The different cold of something becoming something else. He stands up. He does not say anything. He comes back across the clearing and up the steps and past his parents and into the cabin. Mary is awake now, standing in the middle of the room with her hair loose and the look of a 4-year-old who was deeply asleep 30 seconds ago and is now in the world again, and uncertain how she feels about the transition. She looks at the open door. She looks at her mother. Hannah holds out her hand. Mary takes it and comes to the door and stands with her mother looking out at the April morning, at the dripping roof and the dark patches at the south edge of the clearing. "What is that?" Mary says, pointing at the dark ground. "Dirt," Hannah says. Mary considers this with the seriousness she brings to new information. She pulls her hand free and goes down the steps and across the clearing, taking the same path Eli took, with the same careful pace. She crouches at the edge of the snow the way he crouched. She puts her hand on the ground the way he put his hand on the ground. She looks at her hand. She looks back at the cabin, at her mother standing in the doorway. Then she stands up and comes back. In the cabin, the infant is awake, making the small exploratory sounds of a baby who has discovered that sounds produce responses and is testing the extent of this discovery. Hannah goes to the cradle and picks the baby up and comes back to the door. The infant is nearly 6 months old now, not the same infant who arrived at the beginning of this winter. The 6-week-old who could not hold its own warmth, who required the calculation of every person in this cabin simply by existing in it. This is a baby who has come through, who has a face that is recognizably its own face, who focuses on things with the beginning of a genuine gaze, who turns towards sound with intention rather than reflex. Hannah stands in the doorway with the baby against her chest and looks out at the clearing. The infant looks at the sky. This is one of the first times the infant has been at an open door on a morning that does not push its cold aggressively into the room. The first time the outside air has been gentle enough to stand in rather than retreat from. The infant looks at the sky the way babies look at large new things, with the total concentrated attention of someone for whom everything is still being encountered for the first time. Then the infant looks at Hannah, then back at the sky. Thomas has gone around to the south side of the cabin to look at the woodpile. What remains of it is not much. A few days of normal burning, perhaps a week, if the temperatures stay mild enough to run the fire lower than winter levels. He looks at it with the same standing and looking he gave it in January. The same unhurried assessment. The difference is what the assessment means. In January, the woodpile was the future, and the future was uncertain. Now the woodpile is the end of something rather than the middle of it. And looking at what is left carries a weight that is entirely different from the weight of looking at what might not be enough. He picks up one of the remaining logs. He carries it inside. He sets it next to the fire. He goes back outside and stands in the clearing and looks up at the sky. The pale April blue of it, high and clear above the tree line, with the sun already doing work that the sun in January could not do, warming the air rather than just lighting it. Eli comes out and stands beside him. They stand in the clearing, looking up at the sky together, the man and the boy. And after a while, Thomas puts his hand briefly on Eli's shoulder. The weight of it there, and then gone. The kind of gesture that in another man might be longer or more elaborate, but that in Thomas is complete as it is, brief and precise and carrying what it needs to carry without anything extra added. Then he goes to get the axe. There is work to do. The work of April is different from the work of January, but it is not less work. The clearing and the preparation and the repair of what the winter has damaged, and the slow restoration of the farm to its warm season operation. The winter does not release you from labor when it ends. It changes the labor and warms the air around it, and that is enough. Thomas knows this. He picks up the axe. Inside the cabin, Hannah sets the pot on the fire for the morning porridge, and the sound of it, the iron on the iron, the sound that has opened every morning of this winter, fills the room the way it always fills it. The fire burns. Mary is on the floor with her spool. the same spool she has had since before the winter began. Worn, smooth now, from months of use on the cabin floor. Eli comes back inside and sits at the table with his marking board. The infant is in the cradle, looking up at the ceiling of the cabin. The same ceiling that has been above this family for 5 months. Now crossed by a bar of April light coming through the window at a new angle, higher and more direct than it has been since October, touching the far wall, touching the floor near the table. Reaching the edge of the cradle, the infant watches the bar of light. Outside, Thomas begins to work. The dripping from the roof continues, steady and patient, snow becoming water, the sound of a season releasing what it held. A bird calls from somewhere in the trees at the edge of the property. One bird, tentative, the sound of something testing whether the season has changed enough to warrant the announcement. It has. The door is still open. The air coming through it smells of earth. Hannah stands at the fire with her back to the room and her hand on the pot, and she listens to the dripping and the bird and the sound of the axe from somewhere outside, and the sound of her children in the room behind her. All of them here. She stirs the pot. The morning comes in,